I want to begin today's briefing with a question that no mainstream media outlet has been willing to ask. If the United States of America is the most powerful nation on earth, if it possesses the largest military, the deepest financial markets, and the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus ever constructed, then why did its vice president fly to Switzerland to negotiate peace with Iran and return home having agreed to every single one of Iran's preconditions? Think about that for a moment. The United States spent the last 4 months enforcing a devastating naval blockade. It deployed aircraft carrier strike groups. It imposed crippling economic sanctions. It froze billions of dollars in Iranian assets. It threatened the complete destruction of the Iranian economy. And then Vice President Vance sat down at a table in Burgenstock, Switzerland, across from the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, and agreed to a 60-day roadmap that includes a $300 billion reconstruction fund for Iran, a deconfliction cell for Lebanon, and the effective lifting of the blockade on Iranian ports. The mainstream media is reporting this as a diplomatic breakthrough. They are showing footage of handshakes and press conferences and congratulating both sides on their maturity and statesmanship. They are completely missing the story. What happened in Switzerland was not a negotiation, it was an ambush. Iran walked into that room with a hidden, multi-layered strategy designed to systematically strip Washington of every single lever of power it possessed. And by the time the American delegation realized what was happening, it was too late. Today, I am going to reverse engineer exactly how Iran did this. I am going to take you inside the Burgenstock conference room, explain the invisible chess moves that occurred behind the handshakes, and introduce a framework I call the Diplomatic Encirclement, a doctrine that proves that in the 21st century, the nation that controls the coalition controls the outcome. And right now, Iran controls the coalition. To understand the devastation of what just happened to the American negotiating position, you first have to understand what Washington expected to happen when it sent Vance to Switzerland. The American strategy for these talks was built on a doctrine that has served Washington well for 70 years. It is called negotiation from strength. The premise is simple. You crush your adversary economically and militarily until they are desperate, and then you offer them a deal that appears generous but is actually a surrender on your terms. Washington believed it had achieved this position of strength. The naval blockade had been enforced for over 100 days. Iranian oil exports through the Persian Gulf had been severely disrupted. The Iranian currency had been under extreme pressure. The Iranian population was suffering. The Pentagon planners, the State Department strategists, on the National Security Council all believed that Iran would walk into Switzerland as a defeated party, grateful for the opportunity to negotiate an exit from the crisis. The American delegation prepared a roadmap. It was a 60-day timeline of phased steps. Iran would halt its nuclear enrichment beyond a certain threshold, submit to enhanced IAEA inspections, rein in Hezbollah's operations in Lebanon, and in exchange, Washington would gradually lift sanctions and allow limited oil exports to resume. This was supposed to be an American-dictated framework. Washington writes the rules. Iran follows them. The deal gets announced. The president holds a press conference and declares victory. But Iran had been preparing for this moment for over a decade, and their preparation did not involve building bigger missiles or a larger navy. Their preparation involved building a coalition. Stage 1, the Pakistan card. When the delegations arrived in Burgenstock, the American team expected a bilateral negotiation. The United States on one side, Iran on the other, with perhaps a Swiss or Qatari mediator facilitating the logistics. Instead, they found Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif sitting at the table. This was not an accident. This was Iran's first move in the diplomatic encirclement. Pakistan's presence at the negotiation fundamentally altered the power dynamics in the room. Why? Because Pakistan is a nuclear-armed state. It possesses approximately 170 nuclear warheads. It has a ballistic missile delivery system capable of reaching deep into the Middle East and beyond. The unspoken message of Pakistan's presence was unmistakable. Iran is not alone. Iran has a nuclear-armed ally sitting at this table. If the United States attempts to use military force to impose its will, it will not just be fighting Iran. It will be confronting a nuclear power. Washington cannot threaten military escalation against a coalition that includes a nuclear state. The entire foundation of America's negotiation from strength doctrine collapsed the moment Shehbaz Sharif took his seat. But Pakistan's role was not limited to nuclear deterrence. Pakistan shares a long, porous border with Iran. During the blockade, when the United States Navy was preventing Iranian ships from leaving the Persian Gulf, Pakistan served as a critical overland transit route for Iranian goods and energy exports heading to China and Central Asia. Pakistan kept Iran's economic lifeline open, while the American Navy thought it was sealing every exit. Furthermore, Pakistan's intelligence services, the ISI, have deep and long-standing relationships with every major player in the region, including groups that Washington considers adversaries. Pakistan's presence at the table signaled to the American delegation that the intelligence landscape of the region was not what Washington assumed it to be. Iran did not just bring Pakistan to the table for symbolic reasons. It brought Pakistan to neutralize the two most powerful weapons in the American arsenal, the threat of military force and the effectiveness of the economic blockade. But what makes this move even more extraordinary is how long Iran spent preparing it. This did not happen overnight. Iran has been cultivating Pakistan as a strategic partner for over a decade, laying the groundwork through a series of carefully sequenced agreements that the Western intelligence community either ignored or fundamentally misunderstood. Consider the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, signed quietly between Iran and Pakistan, which established a framework for energy cooperation, border security coordination, and trade facilitation. The Western press barely covered it, but that MoU was the diplomatic foundation that allowed Pakistan to serve as Iran's overland export corridor during the blockade. Consider the Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline, a project that Washington has spent years trying to sabotage through sanctions threats. Despite American pressure, Pakistan continued to negotiate the pipeline because its own energy crisis made Iranian gas an existential necessity. Iran understood that by making Pakistan economically dependent on Iranian energy, it was creating a structural alliance that no amount of American diplomatic pressure could break. And consider Pakistan's deepening integration into the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, CPEC, which connects the Pakistani port of Gwadar directly to western China. This corridor gave Iran a physical overland route to the Chinese market that completely bypassed the Persian Gulf and the American naval blockade. Iranian oil and gas could flow east through Pakistan into China without a single molecule touching the water that the U.S. Fifth Fleet was patrolling. Iran did not just bring an ally to the table. It brought an ally that it had spent a decade converting into a logistical lifeline, a nuclear deterrent, and a gateway to the Chinese market. The Pakistan card was not improvised, it was engineered. Stage 2, the Qatar paradox. Iran's second move was even more devastating, because it weaponized an American ally against the United States. Qatar arrived at the Burgenstock talks as a neutral mediator. The mainstream press reported this at face value. Qatar is hosting the negotiations. Qatar is facilitating dialogue. Qatar is playing a constructive role. But let me explain to you exactly what Qatar's mediation actually means in geopolitical terms. Qatar is home to Al Udeid Air Base, the largest American military installation in the entire Middle East. It houses the forward headquarters of the United States Central Command. Thousands of American soldiers, pilots, and intelligence officers operate from Qatari soil. American B-52 bombers, fighter jets, and surveillance drones launch from Al Udeid to conduct operations across the region. Qatar is simultaneously one of the largest exporters of liquefied natural gas in the world. Its North Field, shared with Iran's South Pars Field, contains the single largest natural gas reservoir on the planet. Qatar and Iran literally share the same geological formation beneath the Persian Gulf. Now think about the impossible position this creates for Washington. Qatar is hosting American troops who may be ordered to attack Iran. Qatar is also mediating peace talks to prevent that attack. Qatar shares its most valuable economic asset, the gas field, with Iran. And Qatar's economy depends on the Strait of Hormuz remaining open, which Iran has just demonstrated it can close at will. Iran understood this paradox perfectly. By insisting that Qatar serve as a mediator, Iran forced Washington to negotiate in a room where the host country has a direct, existential financial interest in keeping Tehran happy. If Washington pushes too hard against Iran at the table, Qatar faces a dilemma: continue hosting American troops that might be used against a nation with whom Qatar shares its gas supply, or quietly signal to Washington that the base access might become complicated. Iran did not need to threaten Al Udeid Air Base. It only needed to put Qatar in a position where Qatar's own self-interest aligned with Iranian objectives. The mediator was not neutral. The mediator was structurally incentivized to ensure Iran got a favorable deal. This is the second pillar of the diplomatic encirclement. Iran surrounded the American delegation not with soldiers, but with conflicts of interest. And there is one more element of the Qatar dimension that the mainstream media has completely failed to connect. Just days before the Burgenstock talks, a massive explosion ripped through the Ras Laffan industrial city in Qatar, the nerve center of Qatar's entire LNG export operation. At least 54 people were injured and 18 remain missing. Now, I am not making accusations about the cause of that explosion. What I am pointing out is the timing and the psychological effect. Ras Laffan is the physical infrastructure through which Qatar exports its share of the gas field it shares with Iran. If Ras Laffan is damaged or offline, Qatar's revenue stream is disrupted. Qatar's entire national budget depends on LNG exports. A sustained disruption at Ras Laffan would be an existential economic crisis for the Qatari state. Whether the explosion was an accident, sabotage, or simply a coincidence, the psychological effect on the Qatari delegation in Switzerland was identical. A visceral reminder that their most critical infrastructure is vulnerable, that the Persian Gulf is a dangerous operating environment, and that stability in the region requires Iranian cooperation. A nervous mediator is a compliant mediator. A Qatar that is worried about the physical safety of its gas infrastructure is a Qatar that will lean even further toward ensuring Iran gets a deal it is satisfied with. Iran did not need to claim responsibility for anything. The explosion spoke for itself, and the Qatari delegation heard the message loud and clear. Stage 3, the Strait as a live weapon. While the delegations were sitting in the serene alpine setting of Burgenstock, surrounded by Swiss mountains and luxury hotels, something extraordinary was happening 7,000 miles away in the Persian Gulf. The Strait of Hormuz remained closed. Iran had declared the strait closed to all maritime traffic before the negotiations began, citing Israeli military operations in Lebanon and alleged American violations of ceasefire commitments. The IRGC Navy was actively patrolling the waterway. Commercial shipping had come to a complete halt. Insurance premiums were at historic highs. Global oil prices were climbing by the hour. This was not a coincidence. This was Iran's third and most brilliant move. By keeping the strait closed during the negotiations, Iran introduced a live, ticking economic bomb into the conference room. Every hour that the talks continued without a deal, the global economy bled billions of dollars. Every hour that the American delegation pushed back on an Iranian demand, oil prices climbed. European allies sent panicked messages to Washington, and the political pressure on the White House intensified. The American delegation was not negotiating in a vacuum. They were negotiating against a clock, and Iran controlled the clock. Imagine sitting across the table from your adversary, knowing that every minute you spend arguing over a clause in the agreement costs your economy $300 million. How long can you hold your position? How many concessions can you resist before the economic pain becomes politically unbearable? Iran calculated that the answer was not very long. The traditional model of great power negotiation assumes that both parties come to the table and negotiate based on the merits of their respective positions. But Iran changed the rules. They introduced an external forcing function, the Strait closure, that had nothing to do with the substance of the nuclear or Lebanon discussions, but had everything to do with the economic survival of the Western alliance. Every time the American delegation said, "We need more time to review this clause," Iran's unspoken response was, "Of course, take all the time you need. The strait will remain closed while you review." The genius of this tactic is that it does not require Iran to make a single threat at the negotiating table. The threat is happening in real time, 7,000 miles away, and it is being felt not just by Washington, but by every European capital, every Asian manufacturer, and every global energy consumer simultaneously. Iran weaponized geography as a negotiating tool. Now let us examine the 60-day roadmap that emerged from these talks, because the details reveal the full extent of the American capitulation. The roadmap includes the following key provisions. First, a deconfliction cell for Lebanon. This is extraordinary. The United States has agreed to establish a joint mechanism with Iran to manage the military situation in southern Lebanon. Washington is effectively acknowledging that Iran has a legitimate role in the security architecture of Lebanon. This is something the United States and Israel have spent decades trying to prevent. Iran has been fighting for recognition as a stakeholder in Lebanese affairs since the founding of Hezbollah. In a single clause of the roadmap, Washington handed them that recognition. Second, the $300 billion reconstruction fund. Let me repeat that number. $300 billion. This is money that will flow into Iranian-controlled or Iranian-influenced reconstruction projects across the region. The mainstream media is framing this as humanitarian investment, but $300 billion of economic activity flowing through Iranian channels will give Tehran enormous political and economic leverage over every nation in the region that receives reconstruction contracts. Third, the 60-day timeline itself. Washington agreed to a 60-day window to negotiate the final deal. But who does the 60-day clock benefit? Not America. America needs the Strait open immediately. America needs oil prices stabilized immediately. America needs the European allies to stop panicking immediately. Iran, on the other hand, benefits from every day of delay. Iran has already demonstrated that it can sustain the Strait closure for extended periods. Iran has overland export routes to China. Iran has domestic resilience built over years of sanctions. The 60-day roadmap is not a path to resolution. It is a structured delay that benefits Iran. Every day of those 60 days, the Strait either stays closed or remains under the implicit threat of closure. Every day, Iran extracts more concessions. And at the end of 60 days, Iran can simply declare that the final deal requires further negotiation and demand another extension. The roadmap is a trap disguised as diplomacy. I must address the institutional blind spot that allowed this to happen. The American foreign policy establishment, the State Department, the National Security Council, the Pentagon, they are all staffed by brilliant individuals. Many of them are the most educated, the most experienced, and the most analytically capable diplomats on earth. But they share a fatal structural blind spot. They are trained to view negotiations as bilateral competitions. America versus Iran, America versus China, America versus Russia. One superpower against one adversary. The side with more military and economic power dictates the terms. Iran did not play a bilateral game. Iran played a multilateral game. They built a coalition before the negotiation even began. They brought Pakistan to neutralize the military threat. They used Qatar to create a conflict of interest inside the American alliance structure. They kept the Strait closed to introduce an external economic forcing function. By the time the American delegation sat down at the table, they were not facing one adversary. They were surrounded by a web of interconnected interests, all of which tilted the table in Iran's favor. This is the diplomatic encirclement. It is the geopolitical equivalent of a military siege. But instead of surrounding a city with soldiers, you surround a negotiating position with allies, leverage points, and economic pressure until the other side has no room to maneuver. Washington walked into Burgenstock thinking it was playing chess against one opponent. Iran had already arranged the board so that every other piece on the table was working against Washington. Let us also examine the role of Germany in exposing the fractures within the Western alliance. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius publicly blamed President Trump for the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. This is an extraordinary statement. A senior NATO ally publicly accused the leader of the alliance of causing a global economic crisis. Why did Germany do this? Because Germany's industrial economy is critically dependent on stable energy prices. When the Strait closed, German manufacturing costs spiked. German inflation surged. The German electorate, already frustrated with years of economic stagnation, directed their anger at the government. The German government calculated that it was politically safer to blame Trump than to blame Iran. By pointing the finger at Washington, Germany signaled to Tehran that the Western alliance is fracturing, that not all NATO members support America's confrontational approach, and that Iran can exploit these divisions. Iran saw the German statement and understood it for exactly what it was: confirmation that the Western coalition is breaking. Every crack in the alliance is an additional degree of leverage for Tehran at the negotiating table. But Germany is not the only ally fracturing away from Washington. There is a second, far more dangerous crack forming, and it is coming from the one ally Washington cannot afford to lose: Israel. The Israeli government is furious. From Jerusalem's perspective, the Burgenstock roadmap is an act of betrayal. Washington agreed to a deconfliction cell for Lebanon that effectively legitimizes Iran's role in Israeli security affairs. Washington agreed to a reconstruction fund that will pour hundreds of billions of dollars into a region where Iranian proxies operate. And Washington did all of this while Israel was actively engaged in military operations in southern Lebanon that it considers essential to its survival. Israeli officials, speaking on background to journalists, have described the Burgenstock outcome as the most damaging American diplomatic decision for Israeli security since the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal under President Obama. Some have gone further, calling it a strategic abandonment. This creates a secondary fracture that is potentially even more dangerous than the German one. If Israel concludes that Washington can no longer be trusted to protect Israeli interests at the negotiating table, Israel may decide to act unilaterally. It may escalate its operations in Lebanon. It may launch preemptive strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities. It may take actions that drag the United States into a wider war, not because Washington chose to fight, but because its ally forced its hand. Iran anticipated this. The diplomatic encirclement was designed not just to defeat Washington at the table, but to create fractures between Washington and its allies that would persist long after the conference ended. Every Israeli escalation that follows Burgenstock will be used by Iran to justify further strait closures, further demands, and further pressure. The diplomatic encirclement does not just operate inside the conference room. It operates across the entire geopolitical landscape. And it does not end when the talks are over. It is a self-reinforcing cycle of fracture, escalation, and leverage. 3 predictions. Prediction 1. The 60-day roadmap will not produce a final deal. Iran will use the 60 days to consolidate its gains, continue selling oil through overland routes to China, and allow the economic pressure on the West to compound. At the end of 60 days, Iran will announce that additional time is needed, and the roadmap will be extended indefinitely. Washington will be unable to reinstate the blockade, because the political cost of reclosing the strait is now too high. Prediction 2. Pakistan will emerge as a permanent fixture in Middle Eastern diplomacy. Iran has just demonstrated that Pakistan can serve as a nuclear-armed guarantor at the negotiating table. From this point forward, every major Middle Eastern negotiation will feature Pakistan as a participant, giving the BRICS-aligned nations a permanent seat at the table that was previously reserved exclusively for Western powers. Prediction 3. Qatar will begin a quiet but fundamental reassessment of its relationship with the United States. The contradiction of hosting American troops while mediating deals that favor Iran is unsustainable. Over the next 12 months, you will see Qatar impose new restrictions on American military operations from Al Udeid, or negotiate a revised basing agreement that limits Washington's ability to use Qatari soil for offensive operations against Iran. The American military footprint in the Gulf will shrink, not because of a military defeat, but because of a diplomatic one. Your homework. Homework number 1. Research the term multipolarity and compare it to the term unipolarity. The Burgenstock talks are the clearest evidence yet that we have transitioned from a unipolar world, where Washington dictated terms to everyone, to a multipolar world, where coalitions of regional powers can collectively outmaneuver the superpower. Map the nations that supported Iran's position at the table, Pakistan, Qatar, and implicitly China, and you will see the emerging architecture of the New World Order. Homework number 2. Look up the Al Udeid Air Base Agreement between the United States and Qatar. Read the terms, then ask yourself, if Qatar has a direct financial interest in keeping Iran happy because they share the world's largest gas field, how neutral can Qatar actually be as a mediator? The answer will reshape your understanding of every peace deal announced in the Middle East. Homework number 3. Calculate the total economic cost of the Strait of Hormuz closure from the day it was announced to today. Then compare that number to the $300 billion reconstruction fund Washington agreed to. You will find that the economic damage caused by the closure far exceeds the reconstruction fund. In other words, it would have been cheaper for Washington to simply pay Iran the $300 billion on day one and keep the strait open. Iran forced America to pay the price twice, once through the economic damage of the closure and again through the reconstruction fund. This is the mathematics of the Diplomatic Encirclement. In 1648, after 30 years of devastating warfare across Europe, the great powers of the continent gathered in the German region of Westphalia to negotiate a peace settlement. The Treaty of Westphalia is remembered by historians as the moment the modern international system was born. It established the principle that sovereign states, not empires, would be the primary actors in global affairs. It ended the era of a single dominant power dictating terms to everyone else. I believe that historians will look back at Burgenstock, Switzerland in the same way. For 7 decades, the United States has walked into every negotiation on Earth as the undisputed heavyweight. They possess the largest economy, the most lethal military, and the ability to sanction any nation into submission. They believed that power alone was sufficient to dictate outcomes. They believed the world would always need the American dollar, the American Navy, and the American alliance network more than it needed an alternative. Iran just proved them wrong. In the Alpine conference rooms of Burgenstock, a nation with a GDP smaller than the state of Texas outmaneuvered the most powerful diplomatic machine in human history. They did it not by matching American power, but by surrounding it. They spent a decade building Pakistan into a logistical lifeline and a nuclear guarantee. They exploited Qatar's impossible conflict of interest between hosting American troops and sharing a gas field with Tehran. They kept the global oil supply under siege to create an unbearable economic clock that ticked louder with every passing hour of negotiation. And when the final document was signed, it was not a peace deal, it was a receipt. A receipt proving that the most powerful nation on earth had been diplomatically encircled, structurally outmaneuvered, and forced to agree to terms that it would never have accepted if it had understood the game being played around it. Vice President Vance shook hands. The cameras flashed. The press conferences were held. Washington declared progress. But the mathematics do not lie. The 60-day roadmap is Iran's roadmap. The $300 billion is Iran's money. The deconfliction cell is Iran's recognition. The Strait of Hormuz remains under Iran's thumb. Israel is furious. Germany is pointing fingers. And the coalition that Iran assembled at the negotiating table is not disbanding. It is growing. Burgenstock is not the end of this story. It is the beginning of a new era. An era where coalitions of regional powers can collectively outmaneuver a superpower. An era where geography, alliances, and economic leverage matter more than aircraft carriers and sanctions. The diplomatic encirclement is complete, and Washington still does not understand how it happened. I'll see you in the next briefing.